Well, everybody recommended we just skip Dark Souls 2, but it looks like we're ignoring the warnings anyway. Dark Souls 1 is such a masterpiece that I can't imagine that the sequel could be so bad that it'd even deserve contemplating the notion of skipping it. Well, I hear the game is much harder this time. It's a sequel, I expected as much, and supposedly the story is irrelevant to 3. That's objectively untrue. It actually recontextualizes 1, adding even more impact to the game's overall narrative. If anything, it's 3 with a redundant story. And the big thing people hate is that the world is no longer interconnected like in 1. Then why doesn't everybody hate 3 as well? I heard nothing but bad things about this game going in, but not only was everybody wrong about it, but they were wrong! I see, so once again we're arguing why popular games are trash and why unpopular games are actually misunderstood. I'd rather be unknown and honest than popular and fake. Nobody's watching this anyway, right? Hey, they're still here! Okay, so here's why the internet's wrong again. Silly me, I thought this would be easy after beating Dark Souls 4 times over. Wait, what does adaptability do? Apparently this game was designed to, quote, prey on human senses and phobias, auditory hallucinations, vertigo, and acrophobia. And I gotta say, it worked. Now please never do that again, FromSoft. How did this game retain so many constants from the first game and yet still make me feel lost, disoriented, weak, and helpless, even with all my experience in the series? The original director, Hidetaka Miyazaki, was busy with Bloodborne at the time and merely acted as a supervisor to this game? How is this not a structural disaster? Because he's just one guy. Don't undersell the rest of the talented FromSoft. This game still scares me! Me too! It's wonderful! Dark Souls is one of those seemingly impossible games to make a sequel for, narratively and functionally. How do you move on from either in a way that will add meaningful content to Dark Souls? By subverting the player's expectations and deliberately designing the game around heightening the challenges while also changing up some precious crutches they use to force them to rethink the entire game. And as for the story, we'll get to that later. This game absolutely preys on your instincts from completing Dark Souls 1. It sets you up for traps, forces you to unlearn mechanics in favor of new ones, and even fakes you out with your own expectations repeatedly. Yeah, like when you leave your opening tutorial area expecting a boss akin to the Asylum Demon, you brace for impact and instead are hit with this safe, beautiful seaside vista, Majula. Majula is your hub, so to speak, and through 4 different branching paths from this point, you'll encounter the 4 main bosses you need to defeat on your quest before progressing toward the final challenge. But when you die, because of course you will, you'll discover one of the game's big new changes. Instead of becoming hollow immediately upon death, you'll slowly hollow, losing 1 blip of your max HP at a time until capping at half HP. And the only way to restore this lost health bar is by consuming the game's replacement for humanity, a human effigy. I found that this is mostly a psychological trick, making you feel like you're losing ground and hope, even though you're almost certainly never gonna run out of human effigies. And even at full health, you'll likely still die just as easily as if you had half. There's also this new contentious stat, adaptability, which is directly tied to how many invincibility frames you have when you dodge roll, meaning if you neglect it, you'll be prone to all sorts of seemingly unfair damage while rolling. I actually think this is pretty cool, as it's basically a stat for how clumsy you are. Considering Dark Souls stats and gameplay are all about accepting realistic mechanics to make the game more authentic and challenging, this stat makes perfect sense. It also doesn't take too much investment to match or even surpass the first game's iframes, so don't be a whiner. So most of the game you'll actually be teleporting from bonfire to bonfire, chipping away at one of those 4 branching paths at a time based on which one you're feeling the least intimidated by at the moment. And since they don't interconnect and allow for warping to begin with, the goal is to simply reach new bonfires in order to gain ground and not to fully explore the ins and outs of the greater world. Yeah, and that kinda sucks. But to transition from Dark Souls 1, this allows for the development of more level-based design, offering up a different kind of challenge to even the most experienced of players. So it's like starting Dark Souls 1 with the Lord Vessel, and instead of organically exploring the world design, you're directly pit against multiple long corridor-like challenge areas designed to wear you down before the next bonfire, or one of the game's cornucopia of bosses. The bosses are even designed to disorient and recontextualize themselves based on your past experiences. Some you'll challenge later as regular enemies, or face again but with completely different stipulations to their fight, catching you off guard. This even goes back to referencing the first game. Instead of Ornstein and Smo, arguably the hardest fight in the first game, you run into Ornstein alone, showing how different the fight is without his overweight executioner buddy. And instead of fighting 2 gargoyles atop a bell tower, you face 6. There are so many bosses that luckily these encounters are rare and don't come off as cheap, but instead feel like creative fights that made me think about the game in ways I'd never considered before, and for that alone were definitely worth the inclusion. A lot of familiar enemies pull the same sort of stunts too. I do want to gripe though that too many of the boss fights are basically just against a big solitary knight and not against monstrous horrors of some sort like was previously established as the standard. I'm not gonna complain because I bought this game just craving more Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2 is the epitome of more. It can't even end normally without 4 final bosses fought back to back. The first 2 even fight you at the same time! I'm not joking! It's like, you want more Dark Souls? Okay, well you asked for it. Please stop hitting me. More! Well, this is another inevitable jump in graphical quality moving from one console generation to another, but something about the first game's areas and bosses made them far more memorable to me. That's probably because once you get through an area, there's absolutely no reason to ever backtrack through it, since you can warp from the get-go, debilitating your memory of its place in the world. The game's also so much longer than before, it makes me start to forget whole areas or handfuls of bosses. Or maybe I should just get that checked out by a doctor. Oh yeah, light also plays a huge role this time, with your torch being an integral tool to get you through particularly dark places, lighting sconces and scaring off some enemies. Oh, and remember how the first game had secret illusory walls you would hit to reveal the way? Well, now they're straight up imperceptible, and all over the place after a certain point, but instead of hitting the walls, you've got to tap X while hugging every single flat surface you come across in hopes that one of them will open up into a door revealing the secret instead. You learn that after the game lets you knock down the one and only traditional illusory wall, tricking returning players into fruitlessly smacking the walls for the rest of the game. Jerks! Guess who fell for it? I'm telling you, this game is designed to drive you crazy. It works. Jerks! Instead of treading the same ground as before, the storytelling and ramifications for the endings luckily add considerable weight to the series as a whole. Not something I expect out of a sequel nowadays. So the story begins from your perspective as your character becomes afflicted by the curse of the undead and begins to hollow. And through an impressive cinematic, we watch as your own memories and loved ones fade away in front of you, leaving you alone and without purpose. Already, we're making this huge aspect of the first game feel real by showing it affect us directly. So you catch wind of a legend proclaiming that the secret to undoing the curse of the undead lies in the distorted realm of Drangleic, which you enter by diving headfirst into a swirling mystic typhoon. As one does. And when you come to, you meet a group of aging firekeepers who've long abandoned their purpose and instead mock you for even attempting this hopeless quest. They also warn you that your journey will lead you to the gates of Drangleic Castle, but you'll only find yourself wondering why you even came. That's because the more time people spend in this twisted world, they slowly lose sight of their purpose and mentally unravel until they've completely forgotten themselves and what brought them here to begin with. Now, if the fabric of space-time was falling apart in the land of Lord Dran, it's absolutely shredded in Drangleic. The game's areas are even connected in nonsensical ways designed to bewilder you as you explore the world, so you can too feel the effects of second-guessing your own memories when confronted with an illogical reality. Now, of course, this is happening to the NPCs you meet as well, and though it's especially tragic seeing, like, the blacksmith's daughter return to Majula only for her to forget about him entirely, basically every NPC questline ends this exact same way, and that's a tad disappointing. It's done to hammer home the magnitude of what it means to lose the self, and why you've come this far in the first place. Unless, of course, you've already forgotten. So you meet the Emerald Herald, the firekeeper stand-in, who levels you up and upgrades your Estus flasks if you bring the right consumables to burn in the bonfire. And she directs you toward gaining strength by gathering the souls of 4 powerful old ones so that you'll have a chance at storming Drangleic Castle to usurp King Vendrick. Throughout the game, Vendrick is built up as a king among kings who waged war against the giants, slew his enemies, and built a mighty empire. But when you finally defeat the 4 old ones and reach his castle, you'll be surprised to find that instead of a final boss fight, Vendrick isn't there. Turns out he fled and sealed himself away deep down in the undead crypt, where you will find him completely hollowed, stripped of his clothes, and walking around aimlessly in dazed circles while sad piano music melodies play to orchestrate this massive subversion of your expectations. And the worst part is, for the true ending, you've gotta kill him anyway. He doesn't even have a health bar or fight back until you wail on him for a while, but once he does, it's a real test of endurance as his HP and attack power are ludicrous. Assuming you're playing the Scholar of the First Sin edition, you can then hunt down the crowns of long-forgotten kings and bring them back to Vendrick's discarded clothing to enter his memories, speak to him in the past, and have him restore their original strength, which if worn, completely prevent hollowing. The game is so long, you as a player have probably forgotten by now, but remember your family, your entire life that just faded away? It hurt you so much that you decided to throw yourself into this nightmare just on the off chance that you would find a way to fulfill this prophecy and break the curse? Mechanically, it's kind of useless at that point, but I think that's the point. The tragedy is that you did technically find a cure for the curse, but only for yourself, and everyone else around you will still have their minds rot away, and it will continue to affect countless others until the end of time. Well, that sucks. However, you still got a final boss to confront, or rather 4, culminating in facing Aldea, the mad brother of Vendrick, whose experiments transformed him into a hideous flaming wicker man. Aldea explains to you that this world is cursed to retread these same events indefinitely due to Gwyn's linking of the first flame, an act he refers to as the first sin. So let's get this straight. Countless undead have fought their way to the end of Dark Souls 1 and chose to either link the fire or snuff it out. But in the end, no matter what, time is cyclical, and we are inevitably going to have to do all of this all over again just because of Gwyn's nyctophobia? With that revelation, Aldea presents you with a choice. Either take your seat upon the throne of want and replace Vendrick, continuing this cycle as its new ruler, or abandon the throne in an attempt to break the cycle and pursue an unknown future. And that future is likely one where Ash itself begins to rise and become trapped in this cycle as well. So let's take inventory here. It managed to take 2 sad, hopeless endings and make them 1 sad, hopeless ending. Isn't it brilliant how terrible that is? Yes? I love it! Well, if there's gonna be any segment that feels like a formulaic sequel, I guess this one's the least disappointing to choose. The music operates and sounds almost exactly the same as last time, just appearing during boss fights or specific environments. Which is fine. Yeah, but with the way the gameplay and story were both so well thought out and reimagined to expand the series, it's a shame that the music is basically just Dark Souls 2? Yes, exactly. Yes, this is a harder, meaner, and longer Dark Souls, but take some comfort knowing that if an area really is giving you trouble, that enemies will eventually stop respawning this time after you kill them enough times, clearing the path forward and even making your deaths count towards real progress. That was most likely implemented to prevent any cheesy soul-grinding exploits like last time, but for an experienced player like myself, whenever I notice that an area's enemies are no longer respawning, instead of feeling relief, I just feel embarrassed at how much I actually suck. Well, if you're one of those players who's into getting bang for your buck in terms of game length, Dark Souls 2 is about 20 hours longer than 1 or 3. But if you're not one to appreciate the aesthetic design of video games or their subtext, then instead just expect a game sequel to be the exact same thing again, then good, because you're the exact type of person this game was deliberately designed to break. The positive gamer in me was surprised to discover just how much there was to appreciate in Dark Souls 2 with a burning 8 out of 10. For how terrifying and effective the new design framework is, I find myself more relieved that I was able to beat it and less eager to play it all over again. But I'd absolutely never suggest that fans of the original pass up this incredible follow-up. The critical gamer in me is shocked with the performance of Dark Souls 2 enough to crown it with a 10 out of 10. Whether the general audience picked up on it or not, this is the exact kind of creative thinking we need in sequels. It's the perfect mix of the unfamiliar and series-defined staples to carve out a place in history all its own. But what do you think? Let us know how your positive and critical sides rate Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin in the comments below. Dark Souls 2 was so well designed, it actually did nothing but hurt my impression of Dark Souls 3, which by comparison feels lazy and uninspired. And we like that game! But if you're not willing to give a game a fair chance just because of what you heard online, then you'll never have the chance to let this medium surprise you, 'cause you're just playing with yourself. This episode was nominated by SquadFam. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more, and use the links in the description to nominate your own episode. And thank you to all of our Patreon members, Aspen, Arrow, Sid, Genio, Laura, and SquadFam. Bye.